Being an educator is one heck of a lonely journey, but every step holds a story, an experience that shapes how we teach, learn, and grow. Welcome to the Educator Experience. I'm your host, Salli Carter, and together we'll explore the moments that define us as educators. Through authentic conversations and shared experiences, we're building a community that connects, reflects, and inspires, all while breaking down barriers in education, one story at a time. You are not alone. Let's grow together. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Salli Carter, and this is the Educator Experience Podcast. So, as a business person, I tend to talk business a lot. I connect with other business people, other business educators. And one of the things that I am obsessed with about this podcast and this space is that it allows me to connect with educators from different fields and learn from their experiences, hear their challenges, hear their triumphs in the classroom, have conversations with non-business related people. I feel like I've got two loves in life. We can talk business or we can talk dogs. Other than that, I am kind of like an alien to people. So I hope that y'all are enjoying the conversations outside of your traditional realms as well. And this is why I'm particularly excited about today, because I get to connect with someone in theater. Do the places I work for even have theater departments? I don't know, because I'm all business all the time. Today I sit down with Stefan Sunandan Honisch, who is a scholar in residence at St. John's College in University of British Columbia in the theater department. How cool is that? Stefan shares an impactful essay that has resonated with him throughout his teaching journey, and it is called Demanding Kinder Classrooms. And this is by Daniel Heath Justice. We refer to it periodically throughout the conversation, and we've included a PDF link for y'all as well if you'd like to explore it a little bit more. His interests are situated in disability, access friction, and economic inequality, and his own research arises in part from his own lived experience as a disabled pianist, which leads me to how we're going to do things a little bit differently today. Stefan has been gracious enough to allow us to share a clip of him playing Franz Schubert for the West Point Grey Church for a benefit concert for the Syrian refugees. So we're starting off with that clip, about minute and a half. If you'd like to see some more of his fabulous videos, him playing the piano and wonderful music, please check out his YouTube channel. We have included that link. So without further ado, I introduce my new friend, Stefan. Stefan, thank you so much for joining us today. I am beyond thrilled that you were open to sharing your performance. Thank you so much. And I am delighted that you are in the film school with UBC. I am a business person. I have a natural tendency to attract and gravitate towards business people. And when you and I connected, just I'm so happy. I'm curious about your journey to where you're at now.
Thanks very much, Salli, and thank you for having me as a guest today. I did my undergraduate and master's training in music, at the University of Victoria and University of British Columbia. Um, and then I did my PhD in education, specifically disability studies. And right around the time that I was finishing my master's degrees in music, so in piano and composition, found out through my sister that there was some emerging scholarship on music and disability, which to me, as a disabled musician, and now educator and researcher, I was immediately intrigued by the possibilities of thinking about and pursuing a program of research in music and disability. And then I moved to Sweden for what was supposed to be a 2-year postdoc at Uppsala University, but I was unable to get accessible housing there. I was also not able to find the home support that I needed. So I ended up coming back to Canada and then working outside of academia for about 2 years. And then I came back to UBC for a 2-year postdoc, and that was in the theater studies department where I've been since. And one big source of continuity, in 2004, I moved into St. John's College, which is a residential college on the campus of the University of British Columbia, the Vancouver campus, which is on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam Nation. With the exception of the 2 years almost that I was away from Vancouver, I've lived at St. John's College since 2004, first as a graduate student, then as a postdoc, and then as a sessional. And in 2024, they appointed me as a scholar in residence. My personal experience, and then also in many ways my professional identities, if I can phrase it like that, are significantly shaped by this overarching continuity through my connection to St. John's College.
You mentioned you were in Sweden for a bit and you weren't
Right.
able to get the type of housing that you needed, the
Yeah.
accessibility. How did that experience impact going back to British Columbia and working with your students?
In many ways, that experience of not being able to access the supports I needed in Sweden, despite the support of a number of colleagues, I think more than anything has shaped what has, I think, become a sustained commitment to thinking about access needs in as broad a way as possible, increasingly as universalist and solidaristic. That's kind of a complicated way of putting it, but my experience of inaccessibility, not only in Sweden, but then also just access, is a fairly continuous struggle in Canada. I'm not widely traveled, but wherever I've traveled for conferences, for visits, for one reason or another, access has been a continuous struggle in many ways. In the past, I've thought about this in highly individual terms, my own struggles with access barriers. For example, after my experience trying to secure and failing to secure accessible housing and transportation and home support in another country, and then coming back here and recognizing that many of the same barriers and so forth exist in Canada, and then bringing that lived experience and that kind of broader set of commitments to accessibility and so forth into the classroom, recognizing that in some ways the relationship between individual access needs and collective access needs, and the work of trying to build what in disability justice one thinks of as collective access, something that we all can work towards achieving and that we can find ways to support for ourselves and for each other. Too often that's framed as an either or. It becomes a kind of choice between focusing on what we need individually and how we can support each other in more collective, broad based, solidarity based ways. And I'm increasingly animated by the idea that that's a false dichotomy, and it's one that prevents solidarity far too often.
I'm so curious to know more. You have a unique lived experience and a different perspective than mine in a classroom. So I'm
Okay.
curious to know more about what you're noticing with respect to accessibility and the either or and where you think it should be.
What I think I've maybe noticed or been more mindful since COVID. So it was in Naomi Klein's new book, or fairly recent book, Doppelganger, in which towards the end of the book she refers to normalcy, like the normal way of doing things, as as a crisis rather than a sort of balanced or fairly comfortable state, which one thinks of as a source of stability relative to a crisis. The way Naomi Klein frames the sort of status quo is itself as a crisis. And that passage in her book helps me think more clearly about what I have noticed since COVID. Some disabled people, for example, including disabled people in higher education, have had some sense that what we tend to think of as normal just hasn't been working for many people, right? I started teaching as a sessional when a lot of teaching was still being done online. And then at a certain point, partway through the semester, there was a move to online and sort of hybrid forms. After the lockdowns were lifted, there seemed to be this almost desperate push to get back to something called normal.
Normal. Yeah.
And this framing of the return to normal in terms of teaching and learning has ultimately signified, maybe in unintended ways, that it's a return to the pre-COVID crisis in some ways, rather than trying to find better ways of doing things, more inclusive ways of doing things, more supportive ways of being with each other in a learning environment. My experience is by no means unusual. That when I've asked for online access or online modalities to be available for doing work of one kind or another prior to COVID, I was often told
No.
this is not possible. And then, of course, when the COVID pandemic was declared and lockdowns were required for everyone, then all of a sudden that whole routine of online and hybrid access that became untenable. And a lot of disabled people have pointed this out. This, in some sense, a double standard. That when a specific group of people have asked for certain things in order to be able to do their work and to feel supported and included, we've been told no in more or less ceremonious, sometimes not so ceremonious ways. But when everybody needs it, then it becomes clear that it is actually possible to do these things. But for whatever reason, we haven't kept some of those practices. And instead, there's been this push to return to some imagined state of how good things were prior to COVID.
So, what are some of the things that you're noticing in your classrooms and having conversations with your colleagues about that maybe they're not noticing?
The teaching that I do is based on recognition that the types of access support that work for one person may very well simply not work as access supports for somebody else and may prevent access. Recognizing the reality of access friction, so that trying to create access for one set of access needs or for a specific learner in a concrete situation may very well create access barriers for somebody else. I've had concrete experience of this in trying to provide a range of access supports in the
Mhm.
courses that I design, which are ones that I teach in person, but which I try to design in hybrid ways so that they always have access to recordings of the seminars. They have electronic access to the learning materials, along with captions and transcripts of the audiovisual materials. That range of access supports in certain situations can be experienced as overwhelming for some students. And that may also, in some sense, be connected to a post COVID reality in which so much is done in hybrid formats, so that students coming into a classroom where there's yet more hybrid and online engagement may then find that overwhelming or yeah.
Interesting. I had never thought about it from that perspective that we're actually sometimes doing so much that it can be overwhelming. We're trying
Yeah.
to accommodate collectively, right?
Right.
Yeah.
What I then take away from for trying to refine my own teaching practices
Mhm.
throughout the course of the semester, for example, whatever I learn from the students about what they need in order to participate, I can then take that back with me on my own time and then make sense of it
Really reflect on it. Yeah.
through some of the more theoretical or philosophical frameworks that I find helpful for thinking about teaching and learning in more specific ways.
I appreciate that. And Stefan, if I may share, I
Yeah.
read through the essay that you had sent to me by
Okay.
Daniel Heath Justice called
Yeah.
Demanding Kinder Classrooms. It doesn't make you a snowflake. I noted this one statement that I would love to discuss with you if you're open to it. And
Sure.
it says, if our courses are predicated on the idea that students have to leave part of their humanity at the door, then as
Yeah.
teachers, we're failing at a fundamental level.
Right.
How does that resonate with you?
It resonates really deeply. I first read this article when I took a teaching development program at UBC around the time that I started as a sessional, and so many passages in that essay by Daniel Heath Justice have stayed with me, and that's certainly one of them. The work that I try to do to make my approach to teaching and learning more inclusive and more accessible for more learners, while also at the same time thinking about access and inclusion more expansively. So the way in which Daniel Heath Justice warns institutions of higher education and warns educators not to fail our students by making higher education inhuman or dehumanizing in many ways. In another part of the essay, if I remember correctly, he cautions against treating the classroom as something like a gladiator sport. I can't remember his exact wording, but that's another really powerful metaphor for how we shouldn't do things. And I think too often higher education, the performing arts for that matter, too often do require, in some sense, transcending or overcoming our own humanity in order to pursue excellence, to devote ourselves single mindedly to developing our skills. And when that pursuit of excellence comes at the cost of our own needs as human beings, that's certainly an issue. This has really important implications for how we think about access as well. So, in some of the recent discussions of disability justice, there's a recognition and an insistence really to recognize our own access needs individually. And it's not either our own access needs or those of others, but recognizing our own access needs and those of other people. This process is messy and
Mhm.
it sometimes requires improvisation. I remember reading something written by Haben Girma, a deafblind activist and educator and public speaker. And Haben Girma, in this post, referred to a conference or she was involved in which everybody had different access needs, and not everybody present in that situation had the technical knowledge to support specific kinds of access needs. And what that ended up involving then was a willingness to be creative, to improvise, to do what everyone in that space was able to do to support everybody's presence and participation in the best way possible. And what that didn't look like was a quote unquote perfect process, something that, could be compared to a set of expected outcomes for what successful access might look like. And just as Daniel Heath Justice asks us to recognize that our students are human beings, that we, for that matter, as educators, are also human beings, we also can't and shouldn't leave our humanity outside the classroom. um, if we forget that access needs and accessibility does not primarily or importantly involve a set of rules or procedures or a set of guidelines, but
Mhm.
instead involves really understanding what people need in a particular context to be successful, to participate, to feel recognized, appreciated, included in a specific context. Then I think the relationship between teaching and learning as human and humane,
Mhm.
trying to remember always that access needs are human
Right.
needs.
When I was reading through Daniel Heath Justice's article or essay, it made me think back to when I first went to university at the ripe age of 19. I went to Simon Fraser, actually. I moved across Canada from Toronto to Vancouver and went there, and how it was very different from how our classrooms are now. I mean, they closed the door. If you had a class at 8 o'clock, they closed the door, they locked it. You are not welcome in. If you missed it, it didn't matter the reason, right? You were not allowed in. They were teaching us a lesson or, a lesson about life or whatever it was. and how different our classrooms are now in terms of treating every student like a human. One of the ways that I start my class is asking students, does anyone in this classroom have siblings that they help take care of in the morning and get to school in the morning? Raise your hand. Is there anyone who has sleep problems, any insomnia? I teach a lot of 8 a.m. classes, so these questions are really important. Is there anyone here who has a job overnight that they're working?
Right.
And then they're literally have 1 hour to freshen up and come to class. And there are just so many hands being raised for different reasons. Is there anyone who suffers maybe from occasional depression? I'm raising my hand at that one because it's a struggle for me too. And just to recognize everyone is coming here that who is physically attempting to make it to class, you are
Yeah.
welcome here. Regardless of your circumstance, regardless of the time that you show up, just come on in. If you are
Yeah.
here, you've made it. That is half the battle. And if you can't make it, how can I get you the information? But it's
Yeah.
such a different vibe and thought process than
Yeah.
when I went to school. I, as an educator, can not just the word accommodate is a little
Yeah.
condescending in the term that I'm thinking it, but how I can be inclusive, I think, right? And appreciative of everyone's circumstances of being a student here.
I'm in 100% agreement with what you just said. And it aligns with a lot of what I've been thinking about. You characterized the notion of accommodation as condescending.
In my mind, for that context, it was. I don't
Yeah.
know if that's,
Yeah.
yeah, I just, yeah.
So for what it's worth, I really appreciate that framing of accommodation. And again, for what it's worth, I think it's wonderfully apt. If we all of us can find ways of moving away from thinking about accommodations, I think that would be good. I'd like to maybe connect what you said about accommodations and how problematic it is to think about accommodations for what ultimately might be broadly inaccessible learning environments, let's say, or unwelcoming for a lot of students. But if we recall what Naomi Klein says about normality being a kind of crisis,
Yeah.
um, accommodation discourse and accommodation procedures as they're practiced in higher education, the whole discourse of reasonable accommodation in the workplace implies a set of questions about what reasonable and unreasonable accommodation. If you ask for too much, then that's uh, placing too much burden on employers or on institutions to accommodate their practices. In some sense, that seems more like managing a crisis rather than trying to figure out what has caused the crisis. If we think about accommodating individual employees or individual students or individual faculty within workplaces or environments or institutions that are broadly not welcoming or that expect us to leave our humanity outside, what we're doing is managing the crisis that is the normal way of doing things instead of asking we can change the conditions that caused the crisis.
Okay, so do you have a specific example of how that shows up in your classroom then on managing a crisis versus understanding the crisis?
What you said earlier about your own teaching, when you recognize that some of your students might be working one or more
Mhm.
jobs, might not have money for food or for rent, asking those questions and finding ways to, in a course syllabus, for example, pointing students to resources on campus and off campus that recognize that they might have material needs that aren't, strictly speaking, part of what a teacher is required to provide or even can provide in a classroom, but recognizing that the cost of rent, the cost of food, and so forth, and being unable to meet those expenses will impact their work and obviously their lives. Finding ways to support aspects of their lives outside the classroom. So returning to this idea of recognizing students as human beings, that to me moves us closer. It's by no means enough, but it moves closer in the direction of trying to understand what causes the crisis. In some sense, now what defines the crisis of normalcy is a cost of living crisis, right? Um,
What
and
cost of living crisis, Stefan? What are you talking about? There's no
right,
crisis.
just sort of across the board, there seems to be this expectation that the cost of living crisis is something that we all have to manage and navigate individually, and that we don't bring that sort of difficulty into the workplace,
Right.
and that we don't let it impact the work that we do. I don't know how that's possible. And I don't know how it's reasonable to expect students who are working one or more jobs while trying to learn. I don't know how that is in any way part of a successful approach to teaching. For me, what the difference between like managing a crisis, in this case, the crisis of the normal state of affairs now, which is a cost of living crisis coupled with a climate crisis. We're going through the second worst wildfire season in Canada. These aren't anxieties that we leave outside the classroom or outside the workplace and then somehow do our work and then deal with the effects of those crises after we leave the classroom or after we leave the workplace. Trying to understand the roots of the crisis and actually do something about the crisis means recognizing that there are no walls of separation conceptually or practically between what we do in the classroom, how we show up in the classroom as teachers, as students, and what happens outside.
If I may go back to that, sharing the resources and supports that are available in institutions, for example, if I may challenge that that means that the educator themselves must fully be aware and understand what is available and be connected with them. I work with or I have a lot of conversations with sessionals,
Right.
and a lot of folks are brought in because of their expertise in a particular area, but they're not academics. They're not fully involved in the institutions themselves. They teach, they go home. So there
Right.
sometimes is a bit of a gap in understanding the supports that are available for students. And it takes
Absolutely.
time, right? That you're like, okay, now I have a better understanding of what's available. So I think it starts with educators putting in the time and the energy to understand how they can support or what supports are available. And I think there's a bit of a gap there. I was thinking about this when I was reading that article, that I was reflecting on my own actions, how I can be more inclusive. And one of the things that I already do is I go beyond the syllabus. I have conversations about the different supports that are available. I point to where they are. I talk about where they are in different locations. And then I have some supports come and join in the classroom to talk about them, or I share videos or different links. However, I understand that that can sometimes be a lot of information at the beginning of a class, or people may miss that. So I was trying to reflect on how I can take it one step further. And I came up with this just last night, I think, doing fun scavenger hunt
Okay.
that they can do on their own time, but it
Okay.
could be worth a point, right? Sometimes students can go through an entire university or college career without having visited or understood full supports that are available. So that's something that it made me reflect upon and that I'm considering incorporating into the future, because a lot of, I think, educators who are well versed in supports, we need to make up for new folks who may
Right.
not be as well versed, and to be able to provide that support to inclusivity in our classrooms. One of the first things that the Educator Experience developed was a PDF that we made called the Campus Connection Guide.
Okay.
Actually encourages educators to reach out and create contacts in each of these support services. So it's a fillable PDF that gives a brief definition of the different services
Yeah.
and allows for a space for people to put in their contact information for someone they're reaching out to and what they need to know as a new educator, what they should be
Yeah.
sharing with the class. It's such an overlooked aspect, but
Yeah.
it's on us to really create that inclusive environment.
I wanted to connect that discussion to a specific set of examples from my own teaching related to access and specifically to access for course materials. If For example, I want to ensure that all of the electronic texts and video excerpts are as accessible as possible with captions, with transcripts, that PDFs are accessible for people who use screen readers and for anybody who has a print disability. Ensuring that those learning materials are accessible requires a set of technical skills that a lot of people, myself included, just don't have. But then also it requires the time and the energy that somebody working on a contract basis might not have. And I've had experiences in the classroom, for example, and my sense is that this is by no means unusual, of students needing accessible PDFs, being unable to find them, and then either needing to wait for a center for accessibility to provide those materials in an accessible format, which invariably ends up meaning that a student is reading those well after other learners are doing that. And so I was playing catch up. I've tried to ask before a course starts whether all of the readings and multimedia resources that I wanted to include in my course could be checked prior to the semester starting for accessibility. And that ends up not being feasible because the centers for workplace that provide accommodations and accessible formats are also short staffed. And for various logistical reasons, they can't check materials for accessibility. I've had first-time experience of this, facing the difficulty of either asking students to make sure that they're registered with the Center for Accessibility so they
Mhm.
can secure certain kinds of access, but still end up, in some cases, waiting for the accessible formats to be prepared for them. One of the points of criticism that comes up with a lot of discussions about access is that too often there's this retrofit kind of approach. So, just as buildings that are not designed for seismic safety have to then be retrofitted to ensure that they're up to code, spaces that were designed without access in mind, then and the result is inefficient, costly, and it also ends up not working for a lot of people. What I have ended up doing is creating Word documents or like plain text versions of journal articles or books for students who couldn't access the original PDFs, and then trying to format the Word documents myself before sending them to the students to try to make sure that these documents were then minimally accessible. That's work that I'm happy to do when I'm able,
Mhm.
but also because of my own disability and health circumstances, it's not always possible. And that's a lot of extra work that teachers and students have to take on, given a broad lack of accessibility for library learning materials. That doesn't get into the more complex set of questions raised about access friction, but even when it comes to just basic, what should be basic access to reading materials,
Material,
to
right?
library materials, that's also not working. Returning once again to what Naomi Klein says in the different context of the issues covered in her book, the status quo of library access, for example, is a kind of crisis.
Interesting. So my brain always thinks towards ideas and coming up with how I can create a better environment in my classroom while you're talking. So I personally have never changed any material for any students like you have. Nobody's brought it to my attention. Now, that's not to say they haven't dealt with it on their own and I just didn't know about it. One of the things that came to mind when you were talking is a way of getting to know our students even before the class starts or at the beginning. Are there certain questions that we can be asking as educators of our students with respect to understanding their some of their accessibility needs?
So, one thing which I have been doing both for conference presentations and for teaching is something called an access check. So, this is something that I think a lot of people just, in some sense, do almost intuitively for online meetings, for example, or for teaching online. When we ask, for example, how's the sound or how's the video or how's the lighting in a podcast interview, and then the conversations that you and I have had leading up to our conversation for the podcast today about what each of us might need to participate in this conversation. How's the audio? How's the video? In a more open-ended way, rather than asking, "Can you see me?" or "Can you hear me?" This is a practice. There's an edited collection from a short essay called "The Sticky Notes Snap," and it's about lack of access at conferences and like in-person conferences because this disability disclosure, like the question of whether or not to disclose having a disability to an employer, is um, complex to say the least. A lot of universities do well to ensure that students work with an accessibility advisor on a confidential basis to ensure that they have access to certain kinds of supports. One of the implications of that then is to suggest that framing questions about what students need to participate and so forth, if those questions can be posed in an open-ended way that don't reference like specific types of access barriers or that don't reference specific types of disability, for example. I think that's a good way of doing it. So the question of how's the sound, how's the video quality, instead of can you see me and can you hear me, that moves away from assuming that we all hear and see or perceive the world in broadly similar ways. And then at the same time, it also avoids a situation in which somebody with visual disability or hearing disability might then feel pressured in some way to respond. If these questions about what students think they might need to participate as fully in the course and to have the most positive experience possible, the more general set of questions about what do you think that you might need also recognizes that what any of us might need from day to day, from hour to hour even, might change. And that even for one person, their access needs are never stable or predictable or quantifiable. And if we recognize that, that means that asking what supports might help you today, for example,
Mhm.
and then asking that question each time before a class just recognizes that what students might need to have a welcoming and inclusive educational experience might shift. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you. This has been such a powerful conversation, Stefan. I have so many things going on in my mind about how I can personally reflect and become an even more inclusive educator and create that space that I really continuously am aiming towards. Thank you so much. And as we start to wind down the conversation, I'd love to ask you, what is
Sure.
one piece of advice that you have for new educators specifically?
For new educators, yeah, I think maybe two things. If we are willing to recognize that the sorts of things that we struggle with as contract faculty, for example, in terms of the cost of living, the climate crisis, and its impact on our everyday lives increasingly, if we ground our teaching practices in the recognition that the sorts of things that we might be struggling with outside the classroom are very similar to what our students might be struggling with, I
Yes.
think that that can help us move into a welcoming posture by in some sense, remaining vigilant about the ways in which higher education and the way education is discussed in the media, for example, that sort of pits teachers and students against each other. Um, and I think that a recognition that the sorts of things that we're struggling with, our students may very well also be struggling with. I think that that creates the basis for recognizing that education is ultimately again, I risk being either tautological or banal in some sense, but um, I'm willing to do that. Just that education has to be about teachers and students as human beings. So that's the first thing. Somewhat suspicious of the tendency to treat academic knowledge as somehow impractical or without real world implications. But there's this philosopher, late 19th century American philosopher, Charles Saunders Peirce,
Sure.
a pragmatist philosopher. One of the things he criticized the universities of his own time for was being overly concerned with teaching what at the expense of what he called the will to learn. And what he meant by the will to learn was related to being willing to recognize that the present state of one's knowledge is imperfect and that we should commit ourselves to learning from each other rather than dedicating ourselves just to demonstrating what we know. That's just to say that my advice then, in some sense, we're always new educators. I think all of us would do well to be dissatisfied with our present state of knowledge. And I think working towards access, like greater access and inclusion, is one way for us to always be mindful what we know up to this point and what we think we know are incomplete and things that we should be positively, generatively dissatisfied about so that we do better and do more. When we think about what it means to try to create maximally inclusive learning spaces with others as educators and so forth, that being dissatisfied with what we know and what we've done up to this point can bring us all together in this spirit of the will to learn that Charles Peirce
I
talks
think
about.
that's amazing. Thank you so much, Stefan, my new theater friend. I'm so excited.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for
Thanks,
taking the time from your
yeah.
day to chat with us. This has been incredible conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Salli. And I now have a friend in business, which
Right?
is wonderful.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of the Educator Experience. We hope you're walking away feeling connected, inspired, and just a little bit more supported on your journey. Ready to go a little bit deeper? Join the Educator Experiences community and check out our courses and workshops specifically designed to support new educators as they navigate the ups, downs, and everything in between. You'll find it all at educatorexperiences.com. If today's conversation resonated with you, share it with a fellow educator and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. Together, we're building a vibrant community rooted in support and connection. See y'all next Monday.